PhD program, and I'm here to present a bit of a snapshot of my PhD research today, titled What's in a Name? Calling Domestic and Family Violence Terrorism, Context, Contentions, and Security and Insecurity. I would firstly like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which I present from today, the Ugambe people, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. My research looks at violence against women, and specifically domestic violence, and Indigenous women in this country are disproportionately affected by family violence. I acknowledge the long-standing effects of colonisation that takes many different forms and impacts the lives of Indigenous women in many different ways. My presentation today will be structured as follows. So I'll start with a brief introduction, sort of what's my research about, and then I'll contextualise domestic and family violence in Australia, exploring both the severity and the impact of the issue. Next, I'll move to my literature review. So this is a review of terrorism studies, domestic and family violence studies, security studies, and media studies. I'd like to note that today I will spend a little bit of time unpacking this literature review. It was such a large aspect of my research as it enabled me to begin to make these connections between two seemingly disconnected issues, that being domestic violence and terrorism. And I think it'll kind of set up this presentation and conversation well. I would like to preface this presentation by making it clear that this will just contain some distressing content. Please do be kind to yourself and take a break or leave if you need. I'll also provide links to support at the end of the presentation. Secondly, this research pertains to domestic violence, which is a gendered issue disproportionately affecting women. In light of this, I'll be speaking of the issue accordingly. Men are victims of domestic violence, but again, this is disproportionate to women. Violence should not be tolerated in any capacity by anyone. It's also important to state that domestic violence disproportionately affects women of colour, particularly Indigenous Australians and migrant women. This research looks at the intersectionality of domestic violence, and I reflect upon my positionality as a white, privileged female researcher navigating and exploring this space. Since the turn of the century, terrorism has been central to the public sense of both security and insecurity. The term has rightly been used in reference to acts of violence carried out with an ideological, political or religious motivation with the intent to coerce governments and people more generally. Although it is the case that the public has witnessed horrific acts of political terrorism over the past 2 decades that have resulted in thousands of deaths, this pales in comparison to the level of fear, violence and death resulting from domestic violence across the globe. Research has found that an extremely low death toll exists for terrorism-related incidents in Australia. Between 2009 and 2019, 11 fatalities and 14 injuries were sustained because of terrorism in Australia. To put this in perspective, between 2008 and 2018, there were 941 fatalities from domestic violence. However, media and political and public discourses are often reluctant to use this term terrorism in reference to domestic violence. Although it's important to note, it has been proposed by significant literature and by victims, perpetrators, and advocates. My research examines terrorism in regard to the security threat that is presented by domestic violence in Australia, exploring the obstacles and implications of using the term to describe this form of violence. The purpose of my thesis is to examine and understand how and why we use certain terminology in regard to certain phenomena, how these impact on our sense of security, and how we as a society are able to respond to the phenomena. Described as a hidden crisis, domestic violence is both prevalent and pervasive in Australian society today. On average, in Australia, 1 in 4 women have experienced violence by a current or former intimate partner. On average, 1 woman is killed each week by their current or former partner. New research released in the last fortnight has found that the rate of women killed by a partner in Australia increased by nearly 30% in 2022-2023 year compared to the previous year. For Indigenous females, the rate of non-fatal hospitalisations for family violence-related assaults was 31 times the rate for non-Indigenous females. Domestic violence is the main reason women and children leave their home. Between 2020 and 2021, 42% of people who presented at a specialist homelessness service reported that they were escaping domestic violence. In that same year, 3 in 10, 32% of assault hospitalisations were due to domestic violence. The work of my PhD puts this domestic violence epidemic and the behaviour and of perpetrators, as well as the experiences of victims, side by side with this idea of terrorism, both as an academic discipline and as a social phenomenon. Terrorism has been labelled the scourge of our age, certainly coming to the forefront of the agenda of international relations and other academic disciplines as a direct result of the September 11 attacks. Terrorism studies has been described as an increasingly important subfield within many disciplines, with literature arguing that the rapid growth in studies of terrorism enhances the significance of identifying works that make substantial conceptual and empirical contributions. The discipline has received significant criticism, being described as too narrow, too event-driven, and too strongly tied to government's counter-terrorism measures. Terrorism scholar Walter Rake laments this literary disconnect and confusion, arguing that terrorism is so varied and complex a phenomenon that it should give pause to anyone whose aim it is to understand it, or, to be more precise, whose aim it is to understand the many different terrorisms that the deceptively singular term covers. Closer to home, the Australian government has described terrorism as a dynamic threat. This dynamism provides space for reflective, honest, and conceptual academic investigation of terrorism as a phenomenon, as well as a technique and tool used by individuals in the pursuit of power and control. The word terrorism itself originates from the Latin word terror, described as a great fear or dread. The term is directly related to the Latin verb terrere, to frighten. The first English definition of terrorism was a state of being terrified or a state of impressing terror. The US Code of Federal Regulations now defines terrorism as the unlawful use of force and violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. The definition of the term has been heavily contested in academia, government, and by the public, but a consistent focus of terrorists' use of fear has been a common thread found across definitions. Literature finds that terrorism is the use or threat of violence to create a climate of fear in a given population. This fear is then used to manipulate and control the victim, with research finding that terrorism as a phenomenon is complicated and diverse and simply resists simple definitions. This notion is drawn upon in the work of my research as it advocates for a continual expansion of understanding what constitutes terrorism and subsequently who qualify as terrorists. Literature has found that current public perceptions of terrorism and terrorists has been heavily influenced by the September 11 attacks, Al-Qaeda, and the subsequent war on terror. The conflation of terrorism with Islam has created a powerful stereotype of the terrorist as other and Muslim. This influence has shifted the way that audiences understand the nature and diverse history of terrorism, with research finding that it's often misunderstood as a relatively new phenomenon, noting that terrorism ultimately needs to be viewed in a historic context that goes beyond these key moments in modern history in order to understand its basic ideas and key characteristics. Scholar Martha Crenshaw argues that it is clear upon surveying and reflecting on the literature concerning terrorism, as well as the public debate that surrounds it, that what one calls things matters, finding that the task of definition, which necessarily involves transforming terrorism into a useful analytical term rather than a polemic tool, and it must be considered in light of the relation between language and politics. This notion is important as perceptions of security sit at this intersection between language and politics. This assists in understanding how the public grades the severity of security threats, in the case of this research, terrorism and domestic violence, in direct relation to the way it is described and defined, and the connotations, history, and impact that these definitions or descriptions have. Literature has been described as psychological warfare. According to the Comprehensive Textbook of Psychiatry, the common denominator of psychological trauma is a feeling of intense fear, helplessness, loss of control, and threat of annihilation. This execution of control by perpetrators is of particular interest to the work of this research. This consistent state of hyperarousal, the persistent expectation of danger, and the constant state of fear are key experiences of the terrorized. Literature identifies the key strengths of terrorism, finding that terrorism is useful in that it can be highly effective in negating the effects of the most powerful weapon that human beings have, the human mind. This research also notes and explores the relationship between media coverage of violence and subsequent public perceptions of security. The nature of media coverage of terrorism and its impact on human security is an important area of study because the media has the power and influence to create space or, conversely, close opportunities for discussions and policy and political action on issues of public concern. Engaging with the issues of domestic violence and terrorism, this research is able to explore the effect that media coverage of these issues has on how society views, interprets, and responds to these acts and threats of violence, and how perceptions of human security are shaped through such narratives. Conceptualizing this question of security is another element of this research that has been fleshed out considerably since the early stages and bears explanation. This research laments traditional ways of thinking about security, where the state and its interests are placed at the centre of concern, while grievances and collective experiences of individuals remain subsumed under this larger analytical unit of the state. Engaging with this theoretical distance between national security and human security in order to understand how media coverage of these key security issues affects public perception and informs public policy. On the other hand, literature concerning domestic violence in Australia is also vast. Key researchers like Heather Douglas, Jess Hill, Julie Stubbs, Kate Fitzgibbons, organisations like ANRAUS, the Queensland Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research, amongst a myriad of others, explore the complexity of domestic violence in Australia. For clarity and the purpose of this presentation, there are two key areas of domestic violence literature that this research draws upon. One is political, relating to the process of criminal intervention in domestic violence cases concerning the minimisation of harm, exclusion, misrepresentation, isolation, and most notably, the disempowerment of women in the application of criminal law onto domestic violence matters. Within this area of work, Julie Stubbs is drawn upon. Her work argues that three distinct but closely connected institutions can be identified as major sites of violence against women: the family, the community, and the state, with the work arguing that the function that the state has in supporting violence against women has attracted less attention. This consideration of the state is a key area of interest, as its responsibility to protect women, particularly in regard to domestic violence, is paramount. My research from the very beginning has been challenged at many levels by many people. A key concern is the notion of domestic and family violence and terrorism being inherently disconnected due to the political nature of terrorism, although I argue that this is misunderstood. Research finds that women who are victims of domestic violence are pushed into systems that inherently disadvantage them. For example, the court system, the welfare system, the police system. In one of my research interviews, Australian writer and journalist Jane Gilmore stated that this imposition of structural power is inherently political, intentional or otherwise. The second area of literature is arguably less related to politics and closer related to coercion, fear, power, and control. Here, I draw upon the influential work of Evan Stark, and in Australia, Heather Douglas, whose advocation of recognising the ongoing controlling and coercive nature of domestic violence provided a really useful opportunity to extend the current conversation about the complexity of domestic violence in Australia. This recognition of coercive controlling behaviour has been a focus of plenty of recent literature, including the work of Australian journalist Jess Hill, who speaks to this notion of control, describing it as a strategic campaign of abuse held together by fear. Again, it's this element of control that is of interest, as it's achieved through instilling fear in the victim and then harnessing that fear to establish control and subsequently power. Here, I draw upon the work of Michael Johnson, who describes this dynamic as intimate terrorism. Media coverage of domestic violence has also been described as being an important indicator through which to measure progress towards shifting both social and cultural norms that either reinforce or challenge the place of violence against women in our society. The routine framing of domestic violence as isolated, private, and shocking ultimately does harm for the prevention and deterrence of further violent incidents taking place, as it's covered disproportionately to reality. The key issue addressed in this research is the notion that domestic violence does not receive the level of attention and subsequent resourcing that it merits, most notably in contrast to terrorism or counterterrorism measures. The nature of media coverage of domestic violence and its impact on perceptions of human security is an important area of study because research finds that the media shapes our perceptions of who or what threatens us. This is important in regard to domestic violence, as literature has found that media coverage presents domestic violence as private, isolated, rather than a social issue, subsequently affecting public perceptions of both the severity and inevitability of the potential danger. Again, the severity of domestic violence in Australia cannot be understated. This year alone, we have seen 35 women killed from gender-based violence. As previously stated, domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness in Australia. It's a current, complex, and increasingly critical public policy issue across the country. Research finds that even though the issues of domestic violence and security, they're intimately connected, they're not often considered within the context of national and global security. Research finds that such violence continues to be tolerated, and national security priorities consistently fail to recognise intimate partner violence as a more likely and more preventable threat to people's, particularly women's, lives than many other threats such as terrorism. As advocates have commented, we've declared a war on terror, a war on drugs, but even with more than one woman being killed each week in domestic violence circumstances in this country, we have never declared a war on violence against women. The key takeaway here is that the politicisation of terrorism gives the term power. So to summarise and clarify this framework or way of looking at domestic violence as terrorism, essentially it's twofold. One is stripping it of its politicised historical context and exploring the notion of power, control, and fear used by the perpetrator, as well as the terror experienced by the victim. But the other way we understand this is through harnessing this idea of politicisation. Women who are victims of domestic violence are pushed into systems that inherently disadvantage them. For example, the courts, welfare, police. This is the imposition of structural power that disadvantages women and ultimately prevents them from engaging in society in a helpful way. In order to understand how audiences and Australians generally are understanding the nature, severity, and impact of violence, in the case of this research, domestic violence and terrorism, I argue there must be a focus on how news media covers these acts of violence. What and how the media report has social and political impacts on intercommunity and social relations. The news media's role as the fourth estate is responsible for covering stories that assist in the proper functioning of democracy, sustaining an informed populace. The media and journalists have an ethical responsibility when covering stories, particularly stories pertaining to violence and security, to provide balanced, fair reporting, consistent and vigilant fact-checking, and to ensure that the voices of those affected by an issue are heard throughout the news stories. Such a conversation pivots on a distinction between reality itself and the mediated construction of reality, or the reality that the news media presents to us. While conscious of the current limitations of Australian media's coverage of both terrorism and violence against women, this research argues that progressive worldviews and ethically responsible reporting are central to the core mandates of journalism. Here, we speak to issues like threat exaggeration, saturation, particularly in regard to terrorism, and underreporting, stereotypical reporting, the effect of the court on publishing stories, this in regard to domestic violence. The first portion of my research methodology then is an inductive thematic analysis, where I deep dive into Australian news coverage of both domestic violence and terrorism, in order to understand how stories are being discussed, framed, and categorised. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Australian and the West Australian were selected for analysis. This, as even as possible, distribution of news producers, both ideologically, in terms of them being more likely to be left or right-leaning, as well as distribution of ownership from Fairfax to News Corp, allows for a comprehensive view of news media in Australia. The primary data set, which is articles published between 2013 and 2022, that contain both the term terrorism and the phrase domestic violence. The purpose of this was to understand what the perceived connections were between domestic violence and terrorism in news coverage. How were they being connected? It's also important to note that there was a significant spike in coverage in the year 2015. I think understanding and unpacking the events of this period helps contextualize the conversations that are taking place at that time in the news media. And I will note the current conversation taking place where there are whispers of intimate terrorism in public conversations or media coverage this year is again a result of a number of issues. One being a spike in domestic violence cases, particularly some key murders that are really dominating the headlines, as well as some key terrorist incidents, both Islamist inspired in the case of the Sydney Assyrian church stabbing, and misogynistic inspired in case of the Bondi stabbing. That has caused the public conversation to look at these two issues side by side again. In regard to my research and my timeline, it was found that there was quite a volatile combination of a spike in terrorist incidents and incidents that had a profound impact. For example, the Lindt Cafe siege in Sydney and the Charlie Hebdo attacks in France, and Australia's simultaneous acceptance of Syrian refugees, which is a majority Muslim country. This kind of created a climate of fear, skepticism, and religious and cultural intolerance towards immigration, specifically Muslim immigration. There was a fear of the perceived connection between Muslim immigration and terrorism. Meanwhile, we had the murder of Australian boy Luke Batty at the hands of his father. The murder and Luke's mother, Rosie Batty's subsequent work in the space created an influx of coverage and eventually led to the Victorian Royal Commission into domestic violence. So these incidents were shaping the public conversation in a really significant way, with public policy, funding, and government intervention really taking centre stage and connecting these two seemingly disconnected ideas. The first finding I'll break down quickly is this idea of emergent themes. So although the story includes the term terrorism and the phrase domestic violence, what is the article actually about? What is its central theme? So identifying the themes enabled an assessment of the context in which these conversations or news coverage is taking place, which often subsequently affects the way that the story is framed. We don't have a lot of time to dig deep into these findings, but I'll just briefly touch on them. The first and most dominant theme that emerged was domestic and family violence. So here we saw advocates, academics, and victims begin to use this term intimate terrorism to describe domestic violence. Domestic violence was also mentioned as a previous offence of terrorists, which often spoke to this idea of an escalation of violence, drawing our attention to a really distinct and evident lack of media coverage of domestic violence until what is seen as the worst case scenario happens, that being an incident, a terrorist incident takes place. We also saw descriptions and experiences of domestic violence victims as terrorism or being terrorised. We had high-profile domestic violence incidents, such as the murder of Brisbane mother Hannah Clark and her 3 children. The significant coverage post this incident regard to coercive control laws, particularly information regarding the implementation and passing of the laws. The second really dominant theme that emerged was stories concerning Islamist terrorism. So we saw coverage of the Lindt Cafe siege. Specifically, we saw conversations pertaining to hostage negotiation. The techniques used by the New South Wales Police, which were later found to be inadequate, were found to be reminiscent of the way domestic violence to hostage negotiations were handled. So these two areas intersected here in regard to police procedure and emergency response. We also saw conversations pivoting on funding and policy, particularly counterterrorism funding compared to domestic violence funding. It's also really useful to note that this theme of Islamist terrorism was a leading theme within the search parameters of terrorism and domestic violence, indicating that a search for the term terrorism results in content pertaining to Islamist terrorism, despite research finding that domestic far-right terrorism is increasing in Australia and across the globe. It's also really useful to note that 17% of all articles in the dataset contain the term Islam. So the relationship between media coverage of terrorism and Islam it's discussed at length in my thesis, as it speaks to this notion of who can be described as a terrorist. The next emergent theme that I'll briefly touch on was opinion, or editorial articles. The major players writing opinion articles were The Australian, followed by the Sydney Morning Herald. Again, the Australian's domination of this theme is of note and is discussed at length. Chris Kenny of The Australian was a major contributor in stories pertaining mostly to Islamist terrorism. Kenny sort of peddled what was reminiscent of a moral panic, assessing the dangers of what he coins jihad denialism, a pattern of Australian government refusing to acknowledge the severity of Islamist terrorism, and he argues not acting on the issue enough. Again, there's an overwhelming number of opinion articles focused on Islamist terrorism, 43%, compared to 15% on domestic violence. Research finds that the editorial page of a newspaper, that it serves as a community's sounding board, a conscience. It sets its priorities. So what does this mean for the level of concern in regard to domestic violence compared to terrorism? Opinion pieces are focused far more on Islamist terrorism, but why? Why aren't we outraged enough about domestic violence to sort of write these opinion pieces? These are these questions that are sort of being fleshed out. Another really defining element within this theme of opinion is that the articles are overwhelmingly written by men. This is a really interesting aspect that traverses key feminist issues of representation, voice and authority over narrative, and the subsequent silencing of women. The lack of female voices has a profound effect on the way the issue is presented to audiences. Again, I don't have enough time to deep dive into the content of these other themes, but here are some of the other prominent themes that sort of emerged. So we had Australian politics, profile pieces, and stories pertaining to the Australian police. In that same vein, apart from the key themes that were identified, this is a list of a breakdown of all the other themes that emerged. The diversity here is of note, and again is explored in depth in the thesis itself. Then we move to this idea of language. So this research, as explained, is interested in when and if domestic violence is ever described as terrorism. 6 articles use the term family terrorism. 18 articles use the term intimate terrorism. 7 articles describe domestic violence as an act of terrorism. And 13 use the term domestic terrorism. So here we saw academics, advocates, some journalists, survivors and politicians use this language. And again, this needs to be fleshed out and contextualized in order to sort of start framing and piecing the thesis together. The next data set that was analysed was this idea of domestic violence data. So we found that 16.6% of articles contain data concerning domestic violence. It's really important because the inclusion or exclusion of data affects the way that the issue is contextualised by audiences and subsequently influences public perceptions of the severity, prominence, and impact of the issue. This contextualisation is of particular interest in the coverage of domestic and family violence, as coverage is most often incident-based, and the coverage is governed by news values and news reporting norms, i.e. the cases that are the most violent or newsworthy will get the most coverage, which really has a significant impact on how audiences understand the nature, complexity, or diversity of the issue. It also affects the perceptions of security. Essentially, is this an issue to be concerned about? Is the media telling us it is? The next data we analysed, a simple one, was if there was access to a helpline. It was found that only 2.6% of articles provided a helpline somewhere in the article. Providing access to support numbers or resources is really critical when discussing sensitive or potentially triggering content like domestic violence. Within this data set, it was found that the Sydney Morning Herald provided the resources considerably more than any other outlet. So now this is a kind of the key area of my findings that will really provide quite a bulk of the research. It's this idea of points of connection between domestic violence and terrorism. So just to clarify, when I say points of connection, I'm referring to connections being made by the news media rather than connections being made by me as a researcher. So we have issues like funding, political and police response, connecting these two issues, articles containing threats to personal safety or key fears for Australians. The conversation is also pivoting around death toll, psychology of perpetrators, allocation of resources. The two issues are being connected in regard to how society deals with serious issues, how much public attention is given to each issue. Violence against women and misogyny is another key theme. Intentions of the violence, which affects the way police respond. This was particularly in regard to the Sydney siege, where we saw quite an influx of coverage. And then we had this idea of domestic violence as a template for radicalisation. That was kind of another area that connected these two issues. So again, this is an area that will be fleshed out considerably, and I think is going to be a really key area of interest for the thesis itself. The second and kind of final part of my research design is a series of semi-structured interviews. So these have been conducted, but they're yet to be analysed. So I'll just touch on the approach. So we're kind of starting to identify and ask, particularly journalists, domestic and family violence advocates, and domestic and family violence researchers, what are the obstacles of using the term terrorism to describe domestic and family violence? Is it even possible? The interviews were set up as semi-structured and expected to be relatively short, about 20 minutes approximately, but they all went over this time frame. The questions really aim to spark a conversation about language and identify the obstacles of using the term terrorism to describe domestic violence. Is it something that can be done? Would it be too jarring for audiences, or is jarring what is needed? The questions inevitably garnered an excellent response from the interviewees, with each woman answering them entirely differently. This data is really rich and will really help shape and frame the entire research project. I'm currently in the process of conducting analysis of these interviews in order to really position them amongst the rest of my research. It is important to note that getting responses from individuals that I reached out to proved to be incredibly difficult. The significant lack of funding within the domestic violence space meant that there was simply no time for people to speak with me. I reached out to individuals that worked with Indigenous victims of domestic violence, LGBTQI+ victims, and was told there was simply no time, or they were far too overworked due to a lack of funding. So it's really important to note in terms of actually orchestrating the research itself. So this research aims to spark a conversation and explore how language intertwines with perceptions of security and how we see others and how we see ourselves. I'm certainly in the trenches of this research right now as I begin to shape it into what will eventually be a PhD thesis that will assist in understanding and really pulling apart the domestic violence epidemic in this country through experimenting with language. So here I have provided access to some resources for support if you or a loved one or friend needs it. But thank you so much for your time today. It's been just me and my computer for months and months, so it's lovely to actually speak to real people.